Mr. Leiden, and good morning, everyone. Hope everybody's holy day is off to a great start. We had a nice, simple drive-in, so that's a really good start as well. So a couple years back, I bought my camera, and thus started the quest to find the perfect backpack to put it in. You know, once you buy something, you need something to take care of it, how to carry it, how to protect it, and especially when you're traveling for several days away from home, you need something to put this into. At first, I had a very basic backpack that I'd had for a couple years. It was a sling bag, and it got me through the first feast when we went up to Rapid City. But that was a simple trip because we had our car. I had all the room in the world. I could put everything in there, and it was right there. So I had plenty of flexibility on that trip. But last feast, we flew overseas, and when you travel internationally, you are limited on space, especially when you go by airplane. Especially anymore, they keep on cramming you in smaller and smaller places. And my camera, I needed on the plane with me because I don't trust them to put it in the hold. That's a good way to have everything broken. So I needed a new backpack. So I did some research, figured out what I wanted, a lot of websites, a lot of videos, and I found the backpack that I currently have for my camera. It's got some fancy bells and whistles. It served me well in France and Spain, and along with some other trips since then. But as with all things that you buy online, you soon start to see ads for that same product or similar products. Oh, you bought a backpack? Here's ads for backpacks. You want to start a backpack collection, don't you? You need 5 more backpacks. Yeah, that's how it is. Amazon, it has backpack ads. Facebook has backpack ads. Instagram has backpack ads. You just get them everywhere because obviously that is your life now, according to the cookies on your computer and the AdSense and all that stuff. And while it's a bit annoying, you see camera bags and features that your current backpack doesn't have. It's like, okay, that's cool. My backpack doesn't have that feature. That would be a little bit easier to pack these things in. And suddenly, my fancy backpack isn't quite good enough. But the problem is, if I got one of those other fancy backpacks, it probably wouldn't do something that my current backpack currently does really well. So if I went and bought the other backpack, then I'd be back in the same position that I currently am, because that backpack would then not be good enough, and thus starts the search for another perfect backpack again. And so yes, I would be starting a backpack collection, and we'd have to have a whole room for just my backpacks. I might already have a few backpacks already. Sorry, Sarah. Only one for the camera. So perhaps what I should do is just step back and realize the one I have is good enough. And if I use it and make the most of it, perhaps it will become the perfect bag for me over time. How much do we miss out when we don't think things are good enough for us? Do we let our human drive to consume and constantly obtain things take away from what we do have? Does it distract us from what really matters in life? Can something simple be worthwhile to us? Can we find more in less, while we learn to do more with what we already have? Can we step back and be happy with, quote unquote, good enough? And more importantly, can we be happy with the bread of life? Something we can think about this week especially. You know, I'm the type that wants to upgrade. I like technology, I like gadgets and things. I do have to fight that mindset of, you know, it's just a little bit worn, it's not worth keeping. That's a mindset that I can fall into. But this mindset can keep us from growing along the way. It's a mindset that can make us not be happy with where we are, with whatever situation we find ourselves in. It's a bit of pride to want the latest, the fanciest, and the best all the time. There's nothing wrong with wanting to upgrade. My phone is getting to that point where the battery doesn't stay charged, so I have to start thinking, at some point, I'm going to have to upgrade. But if we get into the mindset, it can drag us backwards. And Israel had to fight this mindset as well. Let's look at one of those times as we turn to the book of Numbers and look at a situation they found themselves in after coming out of Egypt, before they'd even gotten to Canaan. So again, this is before they'd gotten to Canaan. They hadn't yet gotten there to send in the spies. They had not yet been forced to wander for 40 years to the rebellious nature. So again, this is not long after they'd left Egypt. It shouldn't have been a distant memory of being slaves, and it shouldn't have been out of their minds what captivity had brought under the Egyptians. And yet, in this situation, their current situation was not good enough. So Numbers 11, and we'll start in verse 4. Now here we have a mixed multitude, it says, who were among them yielded to intense craving. They wanted something more. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. All these things that we had back there in Egypt, we want those. But now our whole being is dried up. There's nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. God was providing for their needs as they went on their journey. And it mentions down this chapter that they were finding ways to prepare this manna in different manners. It's amazing how creative people can get with the most simple ingredients. As this week kind of shows, you can take flour and water and a couple other things and make all the vast things that we do with unleavened bread. You know, people get creative with it, but this wasn't good enough for the Israelites. So God said, yeah, I'll give you what you want here. So if you jump down to verse 18, he also warns them. He says, thus you shall say to the people in verse 18, he's telling Moses to talk to them, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. You're going to get what you want. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5, nor 10, nor 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. That's quite the picture. Yeah, it's one of those sayings, I'm pretty sure, because we get the saying, it'll come out, you have something where it's coming out your ears, quail coming out your nose. That's different. Idioms are great. But yes, it's going to become loathsome to you because you have despised the Lord who is among you and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever come out of Egypt? God was literally freeing them, taking them from one place of their own to a place of their own, to a promised land flowing with milk and honey. It was a little ways down the road yet, though. And God was providing manna for them to eat along the way, so it's not like they were going hungry. This was not good enough for them, though. They wanted more, and they wanted it now. And somehow they thought they were going to be better off back in Egypt during this situation. They wanted to go back into slavery. That was the mindset. They weren't willing to work with what they were being given. They couldn't humble themselves long enough in this situation to let God take care of their needs in full down the road. But that's basic human nature. It's no different from you or I at times. And, you know, I can step back and say I'm not much different. The desire to want something more than just manna or bread, if you've been eating it for days, yeah, it can get a bit old. But how would it affect our attitude? Does it make us long to go back, to backtrack, thinking back to what we may have come out of, back to Egypt, back to slavery, back to a sinful lifestyle? Well, if this is all that God had for us, I'd rather go back to the world. It could be a mindset that we can fall prey to as pride can creep in very easily. And so this isn't to say that, you know, good enough has to do with everything in our lives. We can't remain good enough ourselves. We have to grow. We have to get better. We grow. Whatever we find to do, we do it with all of our might. That's what we've been called to do. Sometimes, though, physical things wear out and do need to be upgraded. If the brakes on your car only stop you 1 out of every 5 times, they're not good enough. It's time to upgrade them. Clothes wear out. You know, we all have that one old threadbare hoodie that we wear that keeps us nice and warm, and it feels like home. And yeah, that's what you wear. You wear your rough clothes for work, but sometimes they just aren't good enough and you have to throw them out. But if we approach everything in life that's not perfect that we have to throw it out or toss it out, then there's very little left in this world. Often the fact we don't see something as good enough comes from our own inability to be content. If I can just use that backpack that I bought, that I researched, and use it and find ways to make it work for me and stop coveting other backpacks, which is essentially at the heart of the matter, then it will become good enough for me. And in the long run, it's going to be going on adventures with me around the world as I take pictures and travel. So down the road, these same Israelites, their descendants, how did this mindset affect them later in life? Turn with me to John 6, and we'll start looking at another situation where the descendants of those that were complaining about the manna, that wanted the meat, how they were wanting more than what they had before them. John 6 and verse 30. Now this is a situation, this was after Jesus performed the miracle of feeding 5,000 with just a little bit. That little bit went a long way, and people saw these miracles and they wanted more. They wanted more food. And they said to him in verse 30, John 6 and verse 30, they said, "What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do?" All the other things that he had done before weren't good enough for them. They said, "Our fathers ate manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Well, what did they do with that bread that God gave them at that point? They wanted more. They wanted meat. Of course, in verse 32 here, Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives you life to the world." And they said, "Ooh, Lord, give us this bread always." They were still thinking in very physical terms here. And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe." This man that they saw before him wasn't good enough for them yet. The miracles that they had already seen, the truth that he spoke, wasn't good enough for them. They thought they needed more, and they wanted more. The Jews at this time expected the Lion of Judah. They expected their Messiah to come as a lion to restore Jerusalem at the time. They wanted him to come and conquer the Romans, to drive them out so they could have that temple back and restore the glory of Solomon's temple. They wanted him to perform vast, amazing signs and wonders. They wanted something for themselves. Their pride demanded something more than this man that they saw before them. What they got was a lamb. They got a man who sat with sinners and didn't wash his hands correctly in their minds, who broke the Sabbath by healing the poor and the weak. They got someone who couldn't or wouldn't, in their minds, free himself when he was arrested, someone who stood silent before his accusers. That, to them, was not good enough. So they wanted him killed and stood by and watched as he was. When the Romans offered two men, one who was guilty and one who was innocent, they didn't want the innocent one. They took Barabbas, the actual criminal. The innocent man wasn't good enough. And through it all, while Christ was being put to death, that lamb that came said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." In his mind, he's still thinking these humans are good enough to work with. We will find a way to save as many as possible. Christ did this for them and us because we're all guilty of his death. And Jesus Christ won't toss us aside for a better version. He's going to keep working with us so we can become that better version, to bring out our strengths, to fix our weaknesses, because God has the only way for us to become fully perfect. And it can't be done with pride, keeping our minds going back the wrong way towards Egypt. And even God is going to work with those Israelites and give them their chance fully when he brings them all back up. As humans, we seem to always want or think we need something new. Perhaps that other thing does exactly what I want. It's time to upgrade. It's time to toss out that ragged old thing. It works just fine, but it's not the newest thing. It doesn't have the best gadgets. You're using the old model. It's a bit faded. It's got some dents and scuffs. Why would you want that? You deserve better because you're worth it. You wouldn't want unleavened, flat, uninteresting bread. You deserve more. Why would you settle for the bread of life when you can have a cake or a donut, something more filling here and now? Why desire something spiritual when you can fill your physical needs here and now? That's human nature. It's hard to put behind us. Pride will keep us focused on the wrong things, and it will keep us from cultivating what is important in this life and utilizing what is worthwhile. So while we once again at tonight, sunset, eat leavened bread, we can have the pizza, we can have the donuts, the cakes, all those things that we've avoided for the last week, we have to make sure that we never avoid the bread of life. The bread of life is simple in many ways. It's humble, and yet it will sustain us. Just as Christ said there back in John 6:35, he said, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. And that is good enough.